This is Radio Ecoshock with Alex Smith.
Is San Francisco becoming a zombie city? Are cities climate-wrecking machines? All big questions. I'm going to call Gray Brechin an American public intellectual. His best-selling book, Imperial, San Francisco, is still read and studied 20 years later. Gray appears often on television and radio. Right now, Dr. Brechin is a visiting scholar with the UC Berkeley Department of Geography. He is also founder of an important project called The Living New Deal. We have to talk about that, too. Gray Brechin, welcome to Radio Ecoshock.
Good to be with you, Alex.
You will be presenting a new talk, Imperial, San Francisco at 20, more relevant than ever. What directions will you take with the audience at the Mechanics Institute?
Well, what I want to do is to show that the thesis of Imperial San Francisco, which I wrote as my dissertation and then became the book, is more relevant because what we don't generally talk about these days is the contribution that cities are making to the climate change crisis and how they themselves will be victimized by that. I use San Francisco as an example of what I think all great cities do, but it was actually inspired by a winter that I spent in Venice in 1985, in which I really went into how great cities actually happen and for whose benefit they happen.
What was it about Venice that inspired you?
Venice is, of course, I think the most beautiful city in the world, and it's unique in many ways, but it's also like other cities in the sense that its leaders They took from other lands around it, often at great distance from it, because it became an empire in the 16th century and on, both a maritime and a land empire. And so Venice is beautiful because of its parasitism. And that is, I think, true of all great cities. They parasitize the land around them, often at great distance, by the use of remote control technology for the benefit of a very small number of people who own and run them.
And do you think there is an international network of devotees who love Venice and fear for her future now that the seas appear to be rising?
Oh, absolutely. Venice is probably one of, if not the most beloved cities in the world because of its uniqueness, because it's, well, when you walk through it, almost nothing is ugly. The leaders who built it, stitched it together, did so with immense skill and created this remarkable collective work of art. Also, I think it's the last quiet city in the world because there is no automobile traffic there. You do hear motorized boats going through it, but much of the city is very, very quiet.
It's unbelievable that such a treasured city could slowly slip under the sea over the next century. I talked to Luca about the flood defenses, but it sounds like they're sort of under target for what could really happen if we believe people like James Hansen when it comes to the amount of rising seas we could encounter.
Yes, the flooding, of course, is becoming worse every year. And what my great fear is that a tidal surge such as the one that happened in 1966 could happen again because every year that the water rises, the danger of tidal surge becomes greater. And yes, I talked with one of the chief engineers of the MOSE project at one time and asked him if it wasn't obsolete from the moment that it began to be built, because it was planned about 30 years ago, and of course they had no idea how much the sea level would be rising at that time. He assured me that they were completely up to the challenge, but I'm not convinced about that at all, nor are many Venetians. And of course, it hasn't even been turned on yet.
So San Francisco, with its fabled hills, is not too likely to flood anytime soon, but the flooding and the salt water can move all the way up towards Sacramento as the storms get bigger and as the seas start to rise. So it's a concern for you, too.
Well, it certainly is, and San Francisco will flood because the south of Market area that's about 8 feet above sea level, all of that is potentially floodable as the sea level rises. At king tides, The bay is already lapping over the Embarcadero, which is the eastern boundary of the city, and so it will flood. Of course, not as badly as Sacramento and some of the cities up the Delta will. Well, actually, they'll probably flood about the same time. Now, what's really remarkable is that we know that this is going to happen. It's pretty much baked into the cake. But the high-rises in that area continue to go up, as they do in cities like Jakarta and Miami, etc. The developers hope that they can just get their money out before they lose it, because of sea level rise and tidal surges.
It's like one of those party games where when the music stops, somebody is without a chair. But here we're going to have millions of people who have invested in coastal real estate who won't have a chair.
That's right. And so far they've been bolstered by both private insurance and federal insurance, but that's quickly going glimmering because the companies and the federal government are beginning to realize that even the collective assets of the United States are not great enough to pay for the loss in real estate that's coming. I think our problem really is confusing land with real estate. Land is variable. It greatly varies, and it depends on where you build about how safe the buildings built upon it are going to be. That's very true in San Francisco, where much of the ground will liquefy in a major earthquake, and yet it's all treated as if it's the same. A grid was laid on it to not only accommodate the streets, but also the property lines, and it's all treated the same, but it's not the same. Wherever the ground liquefies in San Francisco, let alone where it floods, that ground will liquefy, and the water mains and gas mains will break. And that's what concerns me greatly about San Francisco. It is in that way as unique, I think, as Venice is.
Well, moving on to your work on Imperial San Francisco, why of all cities in the world did you pick San Francisco as a case study of how cities use up everything around them?
Well, I chose San Francisco because it's a city I know best. And also, to be honest, my Italian and Latin are not good enough to study Venice, and Venice has a much longer history than San Francisco. San Francisco is a relatively young city. I know it quite well. I've been studying it ever since I was a teenager, walking around it. And so I thought that would be a good example of a city to study. Also, I had worked in the mass media in the 1980s as a journalist and TV producer, and so I became very interested in who controls the media in a city, in this case San Francisco, but I think it applies to all other cities, and how they shape our thought, not only by commission, but also what they omit. For example, in San Francisco, the two major papers up until recently were owned by the DeYoung and the Hearst families. And those families owned a great deal of the real estate, especially south of Market Street. And so they weren't going to be reporting on their personal stakes in the development potential of that land. And I think that's true to the present because San Francisco has become a one-newspaper town owned by the San Francisco Chronicle is owned by the Hearst family. And it would be worth any reporter's job to actually report on the personal interests of the Hearsts in San Francisco real estate. And that's true of any other city as well, too.
William Randolph Hearst didn't exactly invent fake news. There was plenty of propaganda and outright fantasy in news reporting in the 1800s, and it became called yellow journalism. But I think Hearst papers took that politicized fake news to new levels and a national audience. Is it fair to say that Hearst was kind of the original Rupert Murdoch?
That's a very good comparison. Yes, he was. He had enormous power because he didn't just own a chain of newspapers and magazines, but he quickly went into movies, radio, etc. And so he was the kind of prototype for Rupert Murdoch, who has enormous more power than Hearst did at that time. But like Hearst, the people who consume Murdoch media, particularly Fox so-called news, have no idea what Rupert Murdoch, what his interests are. They probably don't even know who he is. A few years ago, he gobbled up the National Geographic, at which point I stopped my subscription to it because National Geographic had been covering climate change quite nicely. And he is a notorious climate change denier, so I canceled my subscription at that time. But I don't know how they've been covering that issue lately. I suspect that the damper has been put on it because of the ownership and influence of Rupert Murdoch.
But even without intentionally dishonest news, I have to say the so-called mainstream media that I watch, it seems to be built upon violent fantasies and protection of a system of domination. Is that too much am I being too much of a lefty to say that, or do you agree?
Not at all, Alex. It's actually, my mentor in much of this was Lewis Mumford, who pointed out that the mass media, of course, is designed largely for consumerism and for diverting the public from the true crises that are facing us at any particular time. And I think that's particularly true now because we're barraged with images, very entertaining images, of extraordinary violence and sexuality. It's greater now than it ever has been, and you see it everywhere that you go, through airports or on the streets, Times Square, where jumbotrons are screaming at you at all times. People take this all for granted, and of course what they're not paying attention to is the greatest threat to us of all, I should say the two linked threats, which are climate change and nuclear warfare. And this is largely because we're all now carrying around in our pockets these devices which we are completely addicted to, and everybody is watching at all time. But what they're not really paying attention to, of course, is what threatens us all. A great example is the recent so-called presidential debate in which the Democratic candidates were never asked about the most pressing issue, which is, of course, climate change.
Few original San Franciscans can afford to live there, I see in the news, and the others are having a hard time avoiding cashing out during the high prices. It seems both San Francisco and Venice are being hollowed out somewhat of actual local people. A lot of people have left Venice, and wealthy people come from all over the world. They buy in San Francisco as they do extra apartments and big empty houses in Vancouver or London. I fear that we're going to see a kind of zombie city that has lost its soul. What do you think?
I have a problem with talking about cities' souls because I don't think that they really have them, but they are unique in certain ways, and San Francisco, of course, was famous as a kind of anything-goes kind of city. I don't think that's necessarily true anymore, but it was a place that people could move to and really become themselves in a way, because it's always been a very tolerant city, and that's not necessarily true anymore because the land values are so high. What strikes me about San Francisco now is the obscene difference between obscene wealth and obscene poverty, which you see everywhere around the city. It's very jarring, and of course you don't feel safe there anymore because of the degree of mental illness which is so manifest on the street, along with homelessness. Now, all of this is linked to the ever-rising value of property values for those who own it. William Randolph Hearst wrote a letter to his father in 1885 in which he advised his father to take the family money out of mining and put it into land. His father didn't need any persuading in that account. He said to his father, "Every atom of humanity added to the struggling mass means another figure to the landlord's bank account." And the Hearsts became enormous landholders. They still are, as a matter of fact, including in cities like Manhattan, for example. Well, that shows that human overpopulation and capitalism are joined at the hip. For those who own the land, a rising population makes them constantly wealthier. And I think that that's too little looked at, because when we talk about issues like climate change, human overpopulation is seldom mentioned as a causative factor in that, but I think it must be, because the population is growing against a diminishing resource base, and the end result of that can only be catastrophic.
This is Radio Ecoshock. I'm Alex Smith. My guest is Californian Gray Brechin, historical geographer and author of Imperial San Francisco. And in the introduction to that book, Gray, you write, recent archaeological evidence has supported Lewis Mumford's contention that war and the city were born together. Talk to us about that.
Well, that statement by Lewis Mumford really sort of set me on my life course, actually, because I love cities. I spend my vacations usually in cities, and I enjoy everything that they have to offer that I can take advantage of. But I also look at them as parasitic, because I realize that they are that way because they took it often at great force from other cities. And in studying the history of cities, especially in Western Europe, I came to realize that, especially in the Italian cities, which were often city-states, a neighboring city became the enemy city. And those cities were constantly at war with one another because cities are concentrations not only of wealth, but of energy, of frozen energy. And a city such as Venice, for example, wanted that energy and wealth from its neighbors, and it would take it at great force. So Venice devastated much of the eastern Mediterranean in order to make itself beautiful. For example, Venice had a voracious appetite for wood, which was not only a building material, but also fuel, energy, in order to fight more wars. And it realized early on that by deforesting the alpine foothills, it was going to actually destroy itself because it would silt up the lagoon which protected it. And so it then went far afield. It began deforesting the coast of Dalmatia, which is on the eastern side of the Adriatic, and lands all through its empire as long as it didn't affect the city itself. And I think that cities today do very much the same. They take from wherever they can in order to build themselves.
Oh, yeah. We cut down the farmlands and the trees in order to put out some more suburbs that look more or less all the same and to put out more strip malls that look all the same. And it seems like the idea of locality is disappearing on us.
Yes, it absolutely is, because the cities are growing without limit out into their hinterlands. You can see this in places like China, for example, but it's actually happening all over the world, that the cities are consuming the farmlands that actually supply them. And this is a very dangerous situation, especially as sea level rises and begins to flood those farmlands, and also to raise the water tables and desalinate the water tables as well, too, upon which so many of the farmers depend for the water which they pump from the ground. So, again, what you're seeing is a rising human population crashing against a diminishing resource base. Because here again, what's really important is converting land into real estate in order to create urban fortunes.
In last week's Radio Ecoshock show, Australian scientist Andrew Glickson lamented the trillions that would be needed to convert our civilization and maybe save the climate are spent on the military and the next war. Is it possible our mania and our spending on war alone could prevent us from really solving the climate crisis?
I'm glad you brought that up, because I study what the New Deal did to improve the lives of millions of people. And it did so largely because the bulk of the federal treasury was not at that time, during the 1930s, going towards the military. Today, we take it for granted that over half of federal expenditures are going to the military for war and preparation for more war and creating nuclear weapons which could destroy us all within a few minutes. That money is not going towards domestic expenditures, which would, of course, include preparing for and rescuing ourselves from the effects of climate change. So I think people would feel much different about their taxes if they saw those taxes coming back to every town and every county in the country in the form of schools, swimming pools, roads, airports, etc., as we did during the 1930s. We've forgotten that that ever happened. And now as I take the train across the country, I'm just stunned by what a third world country the United States is now beginning to look, and that's because we're diverting so much of the available money into the military and, of course, not into preparing for the changes that are going to come with climate change.
We've been promised a Green New Deal for 11 years now, and opponents say that Green New Deal isn't possible, and some say government planning is always evil. What caused you, Gray, to create the Living New Deal project?
Well, Alex, I spent the 1980s and 90s as an environmental writer and TV producer, and I must say that I became increasingly depressed and pessimistic by what I was learning about what was happening. In the 90s, we were becoming aware of climate change, climate chaos, and sea level rise, and I didn't see any way out of it. And for my own mental health, I had to find something more upbeat to focus my attention on. I'd always been interested in the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, plaques and markers that I would see, and I wanted to find out more about that. And so I created this project, the Living New Deal, because I realized that we're all surrounded in the United States with public works that were created during the 1930s to get us out of the Great Depression. I had no idea, nor did anybody else, of how much we rely upon it and how our lives and those of our parents and grandparents were saved and enhanced by what the Roosevelt administration did to put people back to work and get us out of the Depression. Among those changes, of course, were environmental remediation and actual improvement, because the continent had been just devastated by centuries of exploitation. Roosevelt knew that. He loved trees, he loved wildlife, and he put millions of young unemployed men to work in the Civilian Conservation Corps to remediate what had been done before. And we owe them an enormous debt of gratitude, not only for the expansion of the national and state and local parks and the beautiful buildings that they built, but for the billions of trees that they planted at that time. Now, the United Nations has proposed that we could help save ourselves from climate change by planting over 1 trillion trees. They planted 3.5 billion trees in about 8 years. So that was a good start, and I think what we need now is an international civilian conservation corps modeled on the original one in order to put people to work, save them from homelessness and despair, and at the same time to trap carbon and pump more oxygen into the atmosphere. We have to look back and learn what the Roosevelt administration did that we can learn from.
And you chronicle, literally from the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper, what you call the murder of the public sector, and it's going on every day. What are some of the signs and victims of that war against the public good?
The enemies of the New Deal actually began almost from the moment that it began in 1933 to not only fight it, but to erase the memory of it. And so you see it often in the media, you see it parroted, even by Democrats who will say the New Deal didn't end the Depression, the war did, or the New Deal was racist. This is something you're hearing a great deal of these days. And what we do with the Living New Deal is to take on those myths and confront them and to show what a complex thing it was that the New Deal did actually extricate us from the Great Depression, and also that although it wasn't perfect by contemporary standards, the New Dealers actually tried to remediate some of the racism at the time. We can do better with the Green New Deal.
It's a little difficult for me to see how... I know that you're helping with the memory that is being wiped out consciously by the media of this New Deal that happened, well, about 90 years ago now. Can that memory help us think that the Green New Deal really is possible? Because we need that badly. We either do that or basically we perish to climate change as a civilization. That's my opinion.
Yes, well, what we're trying to do with the Living New Deal is to uncover, to excavate a lost civilization that my parents' generation built during the 1930s, and then they neglected to tell us they had done so. And it is like a lost civilization. It's all around us. Our lives have been improved immeasurably by it. Its sewers, its roads, its buildings are irreplaceable at this point, and yet we're allowing it all to fall into ruin at this point. As far as the war upon the public sector, I think we see it most dramatically in the United States, not only in the fact that all of our infrastructure, our public works, are falling apart, that the bridges are largely held together with rust, for example, but that we so sarcastically, it seems, call our national rail system is falling into ruin, and the Republicans would like to do away with it altogether. And they may succeed in doing so that the United States would be the only developed country in the world without a national passenger rail system. And we see that with all of our transportation systems. You can't have a first world country with public works that are in such a state of ruin as we have, and that's because we opted not to pay the taxes necessary to upkeep it and to feel that the private sector would do that, but of course it can't and it won't do that because there's not enough profit in it, or any profit for that matter.
Gray, do you think the public needs to reach a state of desperation before we can make the changes we need?
Alex, I think that the public is already in a state of desperation. I mean, as I look around the country, as I travel through it, I see the state of sickness in the United States, the horrible crisis of homelessness, which is not only spreading in our cities, but you see it along the railroad right-of-ways as you travel across the country. The homeless encampments that we're seeing now are far more squalid than the Hoovervilles of the 1930s, because what the homeless bring to the encampments are non-degradable things which they scavenge, so they are just sort of vast trash heaps, and this represents a public health menace to us all. But the other aspect of that, which is connected with it, is mental illness, and we have a growing crisis of mental illness in our country, which is perhaps best typified by the rising rate of suicides as well as opioid addiction. And this is not a healthy country. You only have to walk through our cities to see that. And to see what we talked about earlier, which is the prevalence of entertainment and the way that entertainment, spectacular entertainment, as Mumford calls it, has replaced education, so that we don't even have the tools anymore to deal with crises such as climate change, because we are so distracted from what is actually happening around us and the state of ruin into which the United States and so much of the rest of the world has fallen and is falling.
We will be right back with more from author and journalist Gray Brechin and our Italian guest geographer Luca Mascara on the fate of Venice.
You're listening to Ecoshock Radio for the world.
I'm Alex Smith. Get it all at our website, ecoshock.org. Welcome back. We continue a discussion on cities and the New Deal with Gray Brechin, author of Imperial, San Francisco. Then coming up, Luca Mascara from Italy. Now, suppose cities weren't really engines of greenhouse gases, and they are, but supposing that wasn't the case, do you think the super city itself, just expanding and killing off the environment around it, is enough to eventually crash the civilization that brought those cities to be?
I think that there's no question that expanding cities will destroy the planet. I as much as I love cities, they can't continue growing as they have. The cities today are metastatic. They are growing without limit. When I wrote Imperial San Francisco, I asked the question, are cities worth it? Well, I've changed my mind since then. I'm sure that cities are worth it. They are the centers of what we call civilization. What I should have asked is, how large should cities be? Nobody today, as far as I know, is asking that question. They cannot grow without limit, because in doing so, they're destroying the very resource base upon which they depend. One of the things that is remarkable about cities as a human creation is that they become self-contained worlds. And as they grow, they become more dependent upon the hinterland around them, and yet the people within them become less aware of that very dependence. And that, I think, is the danger that we're all in, because for those of us who live in cities, the hinterland is controlled by remote control systems such as aqueducts, for example, and electrical grids. And we just take it for granted that when we turn on the tap, clean water will come out, and that electricity will respond to the flip of the switch. Well, that very soon is not going to be happening anymore, because those systems are breaking down and because the hinterlands have been sapped beyond their potential to replenish themselves.
But I don't see how we can reverse that. I mean, nature would crumble if the billions of people now living in cities tried to go back to living on the land. Is there a way out of this?
Frankly, Alex, I don't see a way out of it at this point, because what we have to confront is the twin crises of human overpopulation and resource diminishment, which comes with it. They're joined at the hip. Really, there's almost no discussion anymore of overpopulation when you bring it up either in the left or the right for various reasons. Well, you're accused, first of all, of being a racist for even bringing it up, because when it was brought up during the 1960s and 70s, like Paul Ehrlich, for example, the charge was made that it was white people claiming that darker people are responsible for it. Today, we're all responsible for overpopulation, and along with overpopulation comes overconsumption. Well, the mass media, of course, has accustomed us all to believe that we're all at least entitled to an American middle-class way of life, and certainly the planet Earth, as we now know, cannot sustain the 7 billion and counting people on planet Earth all having that quality of living. And, of course, they don't. Large numbers of the people on planet Earth are now plunging into deep poverty and despair rather than into a middle-class American way of living. And that, I think, largely has to do with the fact that not only inequitable economic systems such as capitalism and hyper-capitalism that we have now, but also just because of the diminishing resource base, our natural resources.
Well, let's remember there was a time when we could do something, and we could again. So how can we use the site at livingnewdeal.org?
I think what people need to learn is that when we're told that the Green New Deal is impossible, that it's too utopian, what we need to realize is that it's not new. It actually happened once before. The Roosevelt administration tackled the problems of despair, of mental illness, above all of poverty, which is at the root of so many of our pathologies. And they did so brilliantly. And part of that was a strong conservation program. They were environmentalists, especially Franklin Roosevelt, who described himself once as a grower of trees on Hyde Park, New York. A book I can't recommend highly enough is Douglas Brinkley's book, Rightful Heritage, about the green initiatives of the Roosevelt administration. And one of the things that struck me most about Brinkley's book is he tells an anecdote about how when Roosevelt flew to the conference in Tehran in December of 1943 during the Second World War, he looked out of the windows of the plane and he saw how devastated the Middle East was. He knew that it hadn't always been that way, but that was a human product of deforestation. He wanted the United Nations, which was actually his idea after the war, to reforest much of Earth. He felt that that was the way of ensuring peace and aborting war in the future, especially in the Middle East. And we have to do that. And we would do that, I think, through an international civilian conservation corps modeled on the original one that lasted for only about 10 years during the 1930s, and which was another idea of Franklin Roosevelt's. We have to learn what they did during the New Deal in order to see that it is not impractical in the future.
We have been speaking with Gray Brechin, historical geographer and author of Imperial, San Francisco. And Gray, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an honor to have you on the program.
Thanks so much, Alex. It's been an honor to be with you.
I'm Alex Smith for Radio Ecoshock.
Check out the Radio Ecoshock website. We're at ecoshock.org.